I'm not a native of this area. In fact, we didn't move to Ohio till 2000, but I've always been fascinated with what was here before when, and learned about the past history of this area. So this is kind of a culmination of what it was like. You know, again, my family became pioneers, and that pioneer experience was important to me, so I wanted to see what the pioneers were like here. The main focus I'll have here is between 1783, about the next 20 years after the Revolutionary War ended. But we'll go kind of back to set the stage a little bit. When the first Europeans came here, settled the English in New England, and then the Dutch in New Amsterdam or New York. That's where they settled initially, and they traded with the natives at the time. Traded for beaver pelts. That was the cash crop for the metal, the implements that the Europeans had. And so what we have, first of all, then, is a situation in the 1600s with what we call the Beaver Wars. As the beaver slowly disappeared from New York by 1640, the Iroquois Confederacy, that in upstate New York, looked to expand to western furlands where there were available beaver pelts. A series of conflicts developed over the next 50 years called the Beaver Wars. Now, as it turned out, the French were up in what we call Canada today, and the British eventually were able to oust the Dutch. But those two sides fought against each other. The French had their native allies. The Huron, the Algonquin, would fight the Iroquois Confederacy, which with their allies, the Dutch and the British. These battles would then put the traditional European enemies against each other, the French and the British, and also put the traditional native enemies against each other, the Iroquois and the Algonquin. Well, as it turned out, the Iroquois were very successful. As you can see from the map here, the red is the Iroquois. They were able to push a lot of the other Algonquin tribes, natives, farther out west. And as a result, what we have here in Ohio then is the first immigrants to come into Ohio. In the 1600s, Ohio was a no man's land. Now, we did have the Miami tribe located along the headwaters of the Great Miami and over in Indiana, but the rest of Ohio was basically seen as a hunting ground, no permanent residence. But as a result of the Iroquois victories in the Beaver Wars, they exerted pressure on a number of these Algonquin tribes. By 1720, the first immigrants to the Miami Valley were actually Native American tribes that were refugees. The two Algonquin tribes we know the most about, the Shawnee, came from western Pennsylvania. The Delaware from farther east also decided to immigrate to Ohio country. And other tribes were pushed out. The Hurons and the Ottawa settled up near Lake Erie. The Shawnee tribe would be our dominant tribe in the Miami Valley here, and also in southeastern Ohio. After the Beaver Wars were over, the French and the British continued to fight. Now, we call it the French and Indian Wars, but in reality, it was the French and British Wars. The Indians were allies on each side. We had the first was the King William's War, then the Queen Anne's War, then the King George's War, and the one we read most about in our history books was the French and Indian War, commonly called the 7 Years' War in Europe, because that's the one that really had an outcome in it that changed the nature of what it was here in North America. The 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, actually began here in Ohio. A war would accompany most of Europe. This was the one that George Washington went out and then ended up retreating back to Fort Necessity and finally surrendered. And then later on, Braddock took out his troops out there to basically beat the French, but was unsuccessful there. The Shawnee and the Delaware allied themselves with the victorious French, thinking, well, that's good. The British will stay east of the Alleghenies, and this will all be French fur trapping country. But in 1758, General Forbes built a road through central Pennsylvania, and with 6,000 men was able to retake the French Fort Duquesne and renamed it Fort Pitt. And the treaty in 1763 gave all of French North America to the British. This is a map of both Braddock's Road coming up along the Potomac River, that George Washington, of course, Fort Necessity up there, and where Braddock was defeated, and also when Forbes came across the central port of Pennsylvania, were able to be victorious over the French. Well, with the French out of North America, it's all British America now. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, King George issued a proclamation which resulted in all the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains to be an Indian reserve. Why did they do that? Well, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it would provide enormous hunting grounds for the benefit of the Indians and the British fur traders. The British fur traders on the Great Lakes would have the economic advantage over the colonists that would try to cross the Alleghenies. And by preventing westward migration, they could also easily control the American colonies and make them dependent on British goods. And also the British would not have to provide inexpensive military forces to protect these frontier settlers. But then that was in 1763. 10 years later, we start the Revolution, and the Revolutionary War ends in 1783. The Treaty of Paris ended the war and set new boundaries between the United States and British North America. By giving the American lands south of the Great Lakes, the Indians thought betrayed. This Ohio country was given to them in the Proclamation of 1763, and the Indians had never been defeated in a battle. And yet they lost all their land on a piece of paper that they were never even party to. Now, the Ohio country had certain challenges. The land was ceded to the United States, but the problems they faced were they had sectioned settlers occupied the land. It was U.S. property, but anybody could settle down there. It wasn't surveyed. There were no boundaries. They also had violent confrontations with the Indians. And the British still had forts in the occupied areas. Fort Oswego, Fort Niagara, Fort Detroit. They still occupied the areas. And of course, the new government of the United States was totally empty. And many of the colonies had overlapping claims. Virginia claimed this area, as well as Connecticut. And so you had all these colonies that had to give up their land claims. And as a result, in 1785, Virginia ceded the land that was claimed by Congress, but they reserved part of the land, just a little bit east of the Little Miami River, to pay for war veterans. Because how do you pay veterans? Well, the government didn't have any money. They paid them with land. The land ordinance also provided a mechanism for selling and settling this new land out here. The land would be surveyed into 6-mile square townships and divided into 1-mile sections. Section 16 was reserved for public schools, and the surveying began near the Pennsylvania border. Well, here you're certainly aware of what townships are like. A township, basically the 6 square miles. And this is where the survey began in the southeastern part of Ohio. So altogether then, we look at what Ohio looked like. You had the Great Miami River, which was the Sims Purchase, we'll talk more about. The Virginia Military Survey was also done. Interestingly enough, the Virginia didn't use this township square miles. They used a thing called meets and bounds, where they would have all sorts of weird angles and things like this. The survey might be from the big rock to the small tree, and with landmarks. But fortunately, the square miles eventually took over everywhere. So at the end of the Revolutionary War, we have the beginning of a new war out west. The claim to ownership of the land changed from the British to the Americans, but land here would not be peaceful. As settlers moved in north of the Ohio River, they found out there was a culture that was made divide rather than the river. New forts were built, 1785. 2 years after the proclamation, the Army sent Captain Finney with 12 keelboats, 70 soldiers down the Ohio River from Pittsburgh to build a fort. At the mouth of Muskingum, Fort Harmer was erected. At the mouth of the Great Miami, Fort Finney was erected. The forts were intended for the protection of the Indians. and to prevent squatters from settling on Ohio land, because the land had not been surveyed yet, and the government hasn't sold it to anybody yet. And so the government has all these squatters sitting on the land. So here's kind of an idea of what Ohio looked like. You still had the British up at Fort Detroit, Fort Pitt near Pittsburgh, and then you developed Fort Harmar, and then out here Fort Finney. A picture of what the description of what Fort Harmar would be like. Now the squatters were people that moved in and settled on land that they didn't buy from anybody. They just settled on land. It was available. The Army soon realized that the Indians were going to be their major problem. It was trying to get the squatters off the land. Many land-hungry Americans chose not to wait for the Indian treaties or even to wait for government surveys. They settled on the vacant lands by right of occupancy and had no intention of paying the government. So a confrontation soon developed. Hundreds of these squatters had settled on the bottomlands of the Ohio River. 1,500 families claimed land. The squatters refused to accept the Army's orders to move. When they refused to move, the Army burned down the cabins. After the Army left, the squatters rebuilt. It was soon found out the Army was too small, the land was too big, and the squatters were too numerous. The Shawnee refused to accept the previous treaties to give up their land in Ohio. But there was a treaty signed by Shawnee at Fort Finney in 1786, which agreed to give up most of Ohio land, and the Army pledged to keep the squatters off of their land. However, the Shawnee present were starving, and the few that signed did not speak for the rest of the Shawnee in Ohio. So the government said, well, we've got a treaty signed with the Shawnee, but the majority of the Shawnee didn't agree with it at all. The squatters were soon unable to get protection from the Army, from the Indian raids. So they decided to, well, we'll use our militia to attack the Indians. General Logan of the Kentucky militia led a raid up the Miami Valley in 1786. Well, at this time, most of the villages were filled with non-combatants, as the men were further west in Indiana with Chief Little Turtle. They burnt 13 villages, destroyed food supplies, murdered Chief Mulhoney that had signed the peace treaty, surrendered, and actually flew the American flag. The purpose of the Logan's raid was to show force and strike terror in the Shawnee. However, instead of intimidating them to accept a peace, it caused them to seek retribution. After Logan's raid, the Shawnee would not agree to meet any peace councils. They formed a confederacy with other tribes to the west and soon sought help from the British. In September of 1786, 35 native nations, these are nations, including British representatives, met at a village on Upper Sandusky. They rejected that Fort Finney Treaty, signed by a few of the Shawnee, and said the land north of the Ohio River was theirs. The letter was sent to the United States Congress, signed by 11 native nations, and referred to themselves as the United Indian Nations at their Confederate Council. But Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance in 1787. It created a Northwest Territory, which was our first organized territory. Be administered by Congress and eventually admission as states. Required new states to have a public university and waterways, which was the primary highway at the time. Of course, had to have free navigation and no tolls. So here's the Northwest Territory, established 1787. Obviously cover Ohio and a number of the rest of the states that would later come on. The United States government needed money, and except for customs duty, land sales was their primary source of income. There was no income tax, no real estate tax, no sales tax. The income basically came from selling land. The government had also granted bounty land warrants for military war veterans. And so the war veterans, instead of living on the land, could actually sell or exchange their bounty land warrants. And in addition to selling individual land plots to farmers or settlers, large grants would be sold to land speculators, who in turn would then sell that land. So our first example is the Ohio Company of Associates, formed in Boston by General Putnam, Reverend Cutler, and Samuel Parsons as a real estate company to settle Ohio. Cutler went to New York City. I mean, that's the capital of the time, as an agent, or really a lobbyist, to get a contract from Congress for Ohio land. They bought about 1 million acres, paying $1 million in cash in military body warrants. They selected the newly surveyed land at the mouth near Fort Harmar. So this is the first settlement. Again, a great book by David McCullough on the pioneers, focused on this development here. The pioneer party included carpenters, surveyors, boat builders, blacksmiths. They left the east in December, traveled 10 miles a day. They wanted to get to Ohio in time in the spring to plant food crops. They reached the river, Ohio, in the end of February, built a longboat. With the ice gone, they floated on down. And here's an example of the pioneer route, leaving New England, eventually getting down to what is Marietta. They began building their village, and this is the first settlement here, General Putnam landing in Marietta. They built their first fort. Now here in the Miami Valley, we had a different operation going on with Sims. He was a colonel in the Revolutionary Militia. He'd represented New Jersey in the Continental Congress and was a judge. And with several of his families, he also decided to buy some land in this new Northwest Territory. His contact was a man by the name of Captain Benjamin Stites. Stites had been a member of the Pennsylvania militia during the Revolutionary War. And in 1786, while helping settlers chase down horses stolen by the Indians, he went up the Little Miami River, went toward Yellow Springs, and then crossed over and returned down the Great Miami River. Returning back east, he told Sims how fertile the land in the Miami Valley was. So Sims decided to purchase some land. Requested to buy 1 million acres from Congress, but it was only allowed to get about 330,000 acres between the Miamis. Paid about 67 cents per acre, but he was required to survey it, following the new government rules. So it had land for schools, religion, government use, university. So the first settlements then started down the Miami Valley. In late 1788, 3 groups of settlers left on flatboats down the Ohio. The first group settled near the mouth of the Little Miami River and formed the village of Columbia. Sims with another group went further on down to the Great Miami, where it entered Ohio and created North Bend. And 26 settlers landed in Ohio opposite the mouth of the Licking River, where it came out of Kentucky, to start Losantiville. How'd they get that name? Well, the L stand for licking, OS for the mouth, anti for opposite, and village for the village. So this was the name of their town there. So as they came down the Ohio River, the first one at the mouth of the Little Miami was to be called Columbia. Opposite the mouth of the Licking River, Losantiville. And where the Ohio River made that North Bend, that would be the North Bend. So these were the first 3 settlements along the Ohio River. Captain Stites led the first group, bought 10,000 acres from Sims where the Little Miami enters the Ohio. He named the village Columbia, and by 1790, just a few years later, there were 50 cabins there. The little community had the first school, the first church, and also the first graveyard in the Miami Valley. However, floods were common in the valley of Little Miami, and by 1815, it had been abandoned because it had been flooded so many times as settlers moved to higher ground. So then we go over to the Great Miami, North Bend. Sims thought that was the best location because you had a major river, the Great Miami, coming in, enters it there. He began his village in North Bend, where it makes a bend to the north before it goes south and west again. But the location was hilly, and also the Great Miami flooded. So it did not become the great city that Sims had imagined. So our third location there, Losantiville, Denman and Patterson had come out of Kentucky, bought 640 acres, and they had a surveyor, Israel Ludlow, began laying out the ton plot. A group of 11 families erected 3 small cabins with the remains of their flatboats. The land at this time covered with a dense forest, sycamore, maple, beech, oak trees. They knew the land would increase in value with population, so they offered to give a good deal to settlers. 1,700 lots, they'd sell for $1.50 a piece. So here's a statement from Rebecca Reeder that was one of the first down there. It says, "My father, mother, and 7 children landed in Cincinnati on the 8th of February, 1789. There were 3 little cabins here when we landed. They had no floors in these cabins. We lived in our boat until the ice began to run. What few men there were here got together and knocked out our boats up and built us a camp. We lived in our camp 6 weeks. Then my father built us a large cabin, which was the first one large enough for a family to live in. And we took the boards of our camp and made floors in our house. So here's the original survey. Ludlow created half-acre lots in downtown, and then farther out, 4-acre parcels. The first year was a hard one for the three villages. At Columbia, 3 blockhouses were erected, but food became scarce. The settlers had to depend upon fish, game, and the roots of bear grass, which they made into flour. For a period, Columbia was a granary and trading center, but soon Lusanteville became the focus. With additional families arriving in 1790, the little population of Lusanteville grew to 250, living in 60 cabins. Now, Sims had requested the Army to provide protection and wanted to establish a new fort to replace Fort Finney there on the Great Miami, which had been established but had now been abandoned. Sims wanted to be near his new town in North Bend, but the terrain was bad. The site of Columbia also frequently flooded. And so in 1789, the Army decided to build Fort Washington near Lusanteville. So this is the site of that first Fort Washington. It was northeast of the village on a 15-acre plot strictly set aside for the government. It was designed to be the Army's main post on the Ohio River, as it was closer to where the Indian threat would be. General Harmer and 300 soldiers should occupy the post. Now, Cincinnati is a city. St. Clair, as a territorial governor, established Lusanteville as the seat of the new county. The county was named Hamilton after Alexander Hamilton. And instead of keeping the name Lusanteville, he changed it to Cincinnati, which was named after the Society of Cincinnati. The membership of the Society of Cincinnati had been limited to officers that served in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War and named after the Roman Cincinnatus that left his plow to fight for liberty and then returned back to be a farmer again. So what was life like in Cincinnati in 1789? Well, money was scarce. Furs were the common articles of exchange. A rabbit pelt was worth about 6 cents. For a fox, you get 25 cents. A deer, 50 cents. A tavern opened. Ferry service was soon started to cross the Ohio River, and every cabin had whiskey, to which was added various herbs to cure ailments. They soon discovered the water was not good to drink, but if you boiled it or made it into whiskey or beer, you wouldn't get sick. What was justice like in Cincinnati in 1789? Well, the new justice of the peace ordered 29 lashes across the back to Patrick Grimes for stealing cucumbers. Most common offenses were assault, stealing, shooting firearms, or selling liquor illegally. And a man who married 2 women got 75 lashes, 90 days in jail on bread and water, a tar and feathering from wife number 2, and then right out of town on a rail. In 1789, Governor St. Clair decided to negotiate the Treaty of Fort Harmer with many tribes giving all of Ohio to the United States. But the Shawnee did not participate, unwilling to give up their land. With settlers increasing in number, the Shawnee responded with a tax to drive them out. In 1790, the new President Washington urged the Army to punish certain banditti of Indians from the northwest side of Ohio. Now, ideally, he wanted treaties to be made, but General Harmer decided further negotiation would be useless. So with 300 Army soldiers and an additional 1,300 poorly trained and equipped militia from Kentucky and Pennsylvania, the primary target would be the Miami and Shawnee towns on the Maumee River up near Fort Wayne. The British at Detroit had also been notified that they were not the target, and the Indians knew they were coming. So here's the 3 principals: General Harmer, the Miami chief Little Turtle, and Blue Jacket, who was the Shawnee chief. After 13 slow days of march, the Army and militia reached the Indians' village on the Maumee River. They discovered the bridges were burning. The Indians were gone. And so the soldiers, the militia rapidly decided to attack, sack, pillage the Indian village. Well, while they were doing that, the Indians ambushed the pillaging militia and then retreated. When the force under Colonel Hardin chased the retreating Indians, They were led into an ambush. Many of the poorly trained militians panicked, fled without firing a shot. And 2 days later, another detachment was sent after the Indians, but they also received heavy casualties. And finally, General Harmer retreated back to Fort Washington, having lost 183 men in battle with Little Turtle and Blue Jacket. Well, this didn't go very well for Colonel Hardin. He was relieved of command by Governor St. Clair, the territorial governor. To protect Western Ohio, the War Department wanted to establish a chain of forts with additional soldiers. General St. Clair planned to have a summer campaign against the Indians. His plan soon fell behind schedule. With poorly trained militia, he then left Fort Washington in September. After 2 days, they finally reached the Great Miami River, and they began building Fort Hamilton. A picture of what Fort Hamilton would have looked like. And they continued on in October, wet weather, cold weather, to build a second fort, Fort Jefferson. This was to be a supply post, as they were now only 50 miles away from the Miami villages. St. Clair's forces had 2,000 men, 600 regular soldiers, 800 6-month conscripts, and 600 militia. The conscripts and militia were poorly trained, and actually many of them were paid substitutes. Desertion soon took its toll, and by November, the force now was down to a little over 1,100. But it also included 200 camp followers, the wives, children of the militia, laundresses, prostitutes. Much of the army stayed together because the men were afraid to desert in Indian country. But the force was being continuously shadowed by the Indians. At the same time, Little Turtle and Blue Jacket had over 1,000 warriors from various tribes. Compared with the American conscripts and militia forces, the Indians were well equipped. The British supplied them with weapons and ammunition from Fort Detroit. The British hoped to create an Indian barrier state to prevent further American expansion. However, in 1794, they reversed their position as they wanted to keep American favor following the outbreak of war with France, with Napoleon. Well, St. Clair wasn't any more successful than his previous commander was. On 3 November, he camped at a hill overlooking the Wabash River. Just after dawn, when the men had stacked their weapons and paraded to breakfast, the Indians struck. Little Turtle attacked the militia first, who then panicked and ran without their weapons. The regulars formed a line and shot a musket volley into the attackers, but were soon outflanked. The artillery was being wheeled into position when the gunners were killed, as the survivors then spiked the guns. Colonel Drake led a bayonet charge, but the battalion was soon surrounded and wiped out. General St. Clair had 3 horses shot out from under him and was also wounded. After 3 hours of fighting and faced with total annihilation, General St. Clair ordered a retreat and turned their route back to Fort Jefferson. The casualty rate was the highest ever suffered by the United States Army. 632 of the 920 soldiers were killed, 264 wounded. Nearly all the camp followers were killed. 1/4 of our entire United States Army was wiped out. Native casualties, not too bad. 21 killed. The number of Americans soldiers killed was 3 times the number of soldiers killed by the Sioux at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Our history books talk a lot more about the Little Bighorn than they do about St. Clair's defeat. So what was the legacy of St. Clair's defeat? Well, when the news reached the Capitol, the House of Representatives began an investigation. And this was the first congressional special investigation, as well as the first of the executive branch. President Washington summoned all the department heads together. This was the beginning of cabinet meetings. But President Washington was also concerned. He decided to keep some of the papers secret for the public good, and this was the first use of executive privilege. Congress authorized additional Army regular forces, adding 3-year enlistments, increasing military pay. Militia acts were passed, which required every man between 18 and 45 to be a member of the military state militia. And it authorized the president to call up the state militia. But there was fear in the valley. Following St. Clair's disaster, this emboldened the natives with their victories. Many of the families that moved to Cincinnati decided to move back to Kentucky. Blockhouses were built. Clusters of cabins might be surrounded by a stockade. If you worked in the fields, you always carried a rifle. And then just to make matters worse, in that little town of Cincinnati, in 1793, a smallpox epidemic wiped out a third of the population. So the solution to the problem was to create a legion of the United States. Following the twin disasters, Congress recognized the need for a professional army rather than relying on militia and conscripts. President Washington selected General Anthony Wayne to train and command this new army. The legion would have sub-legions of cavalry, heavy and light infantry, and artillery. They spent the next 2 years receiving intensive training in western Pennsylvania. While there were no army there, the Miami and Shawnee continued to attack isolated locations. Wayne moved his army into the Miami Valley and arrived in Fort Jefferson in October of 1793. He built Fort Greenville, about 6 miles past Fort Jefferson. Fort Greenville was the largest wood fort in North America, covering 50 acres. In December, Wayne moved forward to the site of where St. Clair's defeat had been and built Fort Recovery. Now, the British were concerned about Wayne's approach toward Fort Detroit, and they wanted to supply the Indians further with arms and build Fort Miami. Now, General Wayne's strategy was to continue to negotiate, but after the Indians had had 2 victories, they were unwilling to give up Ohio. General Wayne wanted to train and equip a large army and move the supply depots north with the force, moving the army closer to the Indian villages so they'd be rested instead of marching for weeks, attack in the summer when the weather was good, and destroy their villages and the food supply so they'll have nothing to get through the next winter. So here we are in 1794. The Indians had successfully attacked first, capturing a supply train, ambushing a relief force. But then when they tried to launch a night attack on the main force, the Indians suffered losses. In August, when the army reached the Indian villages on the Maumee River, they found them deserted. They destroyed the villages and all the surrounding cornfields, while the warriors had retreated to Fort Miami. The army then built Fort Defiance. Little Turtle saw the strength of the American army and wanted to negotiate, but Blue Jacket refused and assumed the control of the warriors. Now, Blue Jacket anticipated that Wayne would head toward Fort Miami, so he took a defensive position in an area that had a lot of trees that had been blown down. And the battle lasted a little over an hour. The Indians were defeated and ran to Fort Miami, but the British closed the gates and would not let them in. As a result, following this battle of the fallen timbers, with the destruction of their villages, the food supply gone, and not receiving any additional support from the British, the Indians decided to negotiate. The Treaty of Greenville was signed in 1795 and opened up most of Ohio to settlers. After the treaty was signed, the peace chiefs, such as Little Turtle, was criticized by the Shawnee chief Tecumseh, who said they gave away the land they did not own. So as a result of the Greenville Treaty, most of this area all ceded to the United States. With General Wayne's victory over the Indians and the treaty signed, now settlers surged into the Miami Valley. They were anxious to buy the land in the Sims Purchase. It was not only very fertile, but it cost less than $2 an acre that the government was selling the land for. Of course, Sims often sold the land before he actually paid for it, and many of the property owners soon faced questions of legal title of the land. Now, in 1796, Cincinnati was a village of 500 people, 100 log cabins, 15 rough frame houses. Most of the trees in the town plat had been cut down. Stores and taverns soon lined Front Street. Church had been built. Newspaper published. And the Indian campaigns created a large market for the farmers for corn, flour, horses, and cattle. So what was the way west? Well, the first census in 1790 estimated the U.S. population 3,900,000. The Northwest Territory had about 4,300. Most of them were around Marietta. But in 20 years, the population grew to 300,000. The Ohio River was the primary way to get to the Miami Valley. Kentucky had become a state, and many settlers followed the Wilderness Road over the Appalachians to the Licking River. Roads also led to Pittsburgh or Wheeling, majority of the settlers from New England and mid-Atlantic states were the ones that settled in Ohio. The Forbes Road across Pennsylvania became known as the gateway to the West. The Braddock Road up through Maryland also led to Pittsburgh, and there was a cutoff to Uniontown that led to Wheeling. The Ohio River between Pittsburgh and Wheeling was difficult to navigate at low water. So getting down there, you come down the Ohio, the settlers could only carry about 2 to 3 tons of material in a wagon, but a flatboat, they could carry 20 tons. Even if a boat cost $30, the family could travel in relatively safety and comfort. In 10 years, so many flatboats were built that the timber became scarce around Pittsburgh. Upon reaching Pittsburgh or Wheeling, the settler would have to buy or build a boat. The most common boats were flatboats, able to carry a family and also their livestock, easily constructed. And then once they got to the destination, they could be dismantled and used for a cabin or shelter. In addition to lumber mills, the river towns had boat builders that would also construct them. So this is your typical flatboat coming down the Ohio with the animals on it, a cabin there. Flatboats were built with low draft and without keels. Low water occurred in the summer and winter, so most travel will occur in late spring. Flatboats could also be used to get the goods to market, the produce and farm crops they would have, down to New Orleans. It would only take 10 days or 2 weeks to flow down the river versus trying to go back over the Alleghenies to the East Coast. Larger flatboats might carry several families in addition to livestock. You could hire a professional flatboat crew. 3,000 flatboats might descend down the Ohio River in a single year, till about 1820 when the steamboat era began. But there were threats to river travel. Lots of obstacles coming down the river. Many of the early travelers faced Indian threats. Cabins often had slots for rifles. River pirates might prey on isolated flatboats. And the biggest obstacle was the river itself. Hidden snags, floating driftwoods, changing currents, sandbars. Many times boats would be lashed together in a boat train for mutual protection. The Ohio River ended up breeding democracy. In Europe, mountains separated cultures, nationalities. There were barriers. But the mountains here didn't become a barrier. When the Appalachian barrier was broken, settlers came from everywhere. Families from every background and culture surged into Ohio. Farmers, tradesmen, lawyers, pastors, all came to Ohio. And it bred democracy. Going down the Ohio on flatboats and settling in raw territory made everybody equal. Each man had to be self-sufficient and passed his life without regard to the smiles and frowns of men in power. Eventually, there were 2 views of the Ohio River. To outsiders, the Ohio River was seen as a boundary that divided a nation. It had been the dividing line between settlers in Kentucky and Indians in the 1700s. In the 1800s, it would be a dividing line between the free and the slave states, seen as the River Jordan for escaping slaves. But to the settlers that moved into the Ohio Valley, the river was a great unifier, established regional identity as they saw themselves as Westerners. Soon additional villages occurred: Marietta, Columbia, North Bend, Cincinnati, Gallipolis, Portsmouth. But the destination for many was Cincinnati. It took about 2 weeks on a flatboat from Pittsburgh. Once settlers got to the Miami Valley, they would often look to buy land to farm from Sims or from the other land speculators that had already bought land in the Sims purchase. Even with the Indian threat diminished after the Battle of Fallen Timbers, they still faced a daunting task to try to build a cabin, break ground for a crop in this forested wilderness. A flatboat might take it apart, used to create a new shelter. Log cabins became very common before lumber mills were started. Settlers would get together to help each other out building a cabin. One man couldn't build a cabin himself, couldn't lift a log up. Oak and hickory would be notched to form walls, clay chinking to fill the gaps, and a chimney and a fireplace would be made out of stones, also be added. And it was after I moved here to Ohio that I discovered we had pioneers in our own family. My wife, Catherine Vaughn's 4th grade grandfather, James Vaughn, lived and farmed in Vermont during the Revolutionary War. Of his 13 children, his son George was born in 1771. Now, when George got married in 1803, he planned to farm also to support his new family. But land in New England sold for $15 an acre, compared to under $1 an acre in Ohio. So the Vaughn family decided to move to Ohio. In 1804, with their new baby, they made the trek west in the winter. Well, why the winter? Well, New York had built a road across the Mohawk Valley from Albany to Buffalo, and they traveled in the winter in a 4-horse sleigh because you could cross the frozen creeks and over the packed snow with the stumps. They continue west along Lake Erie. They'd often spend overnight at inns or taverns along the road. So this is the route the Vaughn family took. From Lake Erie, they followed a trail with stumps yet to be removed that went south to Steubenville and the Ohio River. Here they waited until spring. They rafted down the Ohio River to Columbia and bought their first piece of land. And then they sold that land and moved downriver and purchased acreage west of Cincinnati, where they developed their farm. So here's my wife's relatives came in, down the Ohio River on the flatboat, stopped initially in Columbia. They went over land to the hill overlooking Cincinnati. And George Vaughn bought the first 51 acres from the sale purchase west of Cincinnati. And with that case study, I'd like to then conclude by saying that after that, people moved up the rivers. Cincinnati, Hamilton, Milford, Waynesville, Centerville, Dayton, Springfield, Lebanon, Xenia, and Troy. So a quick snapshot of the frontier between the Miamis. Thank you. Questions?
Do we have any questions?
Several slides ago, you mentioned a Patterson that came and bought land with somebody else.
Yes, he came up from Kentucky.
Was that John Patterson?
It was a relative of John, yes.
Yeah. You mentioned twice in this the Presbyterian Church. Was that the dominant religion at that time?
Not really, but there was a wide variety of them. It just happened to be the first church that was built. This whole area in the 1820s especially, you see the religious revival, the Quakers and the Shakers, and the Mormons were established, and all sorts of things were going on at that time frame. But I just pulled out, this was the first church built. It happened to be the way it was.
What was the name of the road that the Vaughn family? What was the name of the road that the Vaughn family took?
Well, it's interesting. It changed its name. So originally it was Vaughn Road, but I can show you the actual street map and everything else of what it is. It changed. And in fact, it was interesting looking at the Vaughn family, because we didn't even know they were here, but looking at their history, that the baby that came with him was called Liberty, born on the 4th of July. And Liberty, once he grew up, got married, and they moved to Indiana to farm. But then when their boy grew up, same thing, there was no land. So he moved out the Oregon Trail to Oregon and said, it's great out here. And so Liberty and his family then in the late 1840s got on the Oregon Trail and moved out there also. And we've got the picture of Liberty's gravesite there in Oregon. So people kept moving west all the time.
How did you find out about all of your descendants?
Well, again, it's just a lot of ancestry work. And one of the interesting things is the Vaughn family here, one of the great-grandchildren, married the family my grandparents had come from in Kansas City. So in 1927, a member of my wife's family tree and a member of my family tree got married. And my wife grew up in Philadelphia, I grew up in Seattle. But the two family trees came together back in the 1927. So it's interesting, and that's kind of what got me started in all this about how the families developed and things like this. Of doing the research back up the line about where the people were from, and then I got interested in what they did here, why they did it, and things like that.
What kind of gardens or vegetables they might have grown?
Basically, in these early days, the crops were primarily wheat and corn and barley, and then they would raise a lot of pigs because pigs had a lot of piglets, and you could easily feed them, and then they could smoke them for the wintertime. And Cincinnati soon got the name of Porkopolis because they shipped all the pork down to the plantations down south, and that's what they started with initially. But it's interesting as you go on to the 1820s and 30s and things like this, that as you further developed the mills with water power. And you got to remember back in this time frame, there's no electricity. They'd never heard of it before. And everything's water powered or wind powered, or mostly horse powered. And but that's what the farmers did. Most of them were all pretty much self-sufficient. You'd have to have your own cow for milk, your own chickens for eggs. And then if they had a cash crop of any kind, most of the corn was either fed to the animals or turned into whiskey because it was easy to ship. And of course the flour, the wheat was made into flour, things like that.